Close your eyes. Let the weight of the modern world fall away. Tonight, we're traveling back to a moment in history so dark, so terrifying, that it changed the course of human civilization forever. Picture this. London, 1348. A city of timber and stone, of narrow streets and crowded houses, where 50,000 souls live packed together in medieval squalor. The Thames flows thick and dark. The air smells of smoke and waste and life continuing as it always has. And then the ships arrive. They come from the continent, their holds full of cargo and silence and something else, something invisible, something deadly, something that will kill half the city before winter comes again. This is the story of the night the Black Death came to London. The night everything changed. The night the streets filled with screams and the church bells wouldn't stop ringing, and people realized that all their prayers, all their wealth, all their certainties meant absolutely nothing against what was coming. Before we begin this journey into darkness, if you find comfort in these historical tales as you drift off to sleep, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. And if this story helps you rest tonight, a quiet like before you sleep would mean everything. So, settle in, let your breathing slow, and let me take you there, to a city on the edge of apocalypse, to streets that will soon run with death, to a moment when humanity faced something it couldn't understand, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. Let's begin. The ships came in autumn, when the air was already turning cold, and the Thames smelled of fish and rot and the thousand small industries that kept London alive. You didn't notice them at first, just another convoy of merchant vessels from the continent, their sails patched and stained with salt and use, their hulls riding low in the water with cargo from Calais and Bordeaux and places you'll never see. You're standing on the docks because that's where you work, loading and unloading the endless stream of goods that flow through London like blood through a body. Wool going out, wine coming in, the rhythm of commerce that sustained your family for 3 generations. The dock workers noticed something was wrong, though. They always noticed. They were the first to board, the first to handle the ropes thick with salt and God knows what else, the first to descend into holds that smelled wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still. There should have been rats everywhere. There were always rats on ships, bold as cats fighting over scraps of grain and salted meat. But these holds were strangely empty of the usual scurrying sounds. Just cargo stacked in the darkness, and silence, and a smell that made even hardened sailors wrinkle their noses and step back. Something sweet and rotten at the same time, like fruit left too long in the sun, like meat gone bad but with an undertone of something else, something you couldn't quite identify. One of the crew members was still alive when they found him, curled in a corner of the hold, his skin covered in dark blotches that looked like bruises, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He died before they could get him off the ship, just stopped breathing, there in the thin autumn sunlight, his eyes still open, staring at nothing. The dock workers shrugged and did their jobs anyway, because what choice did they have? Bills needed paying, families needed feeding, and a strange smell and one dead sailor were just another indignity in a life full of them. They unloaded the cargo, bolts of cloth, barrels of wine, crates of spices, and distributed it throughout the city, to the markets, to the warehouses, to the shops where Londoners would buy these goods and take them home, and handle them with unwashed hands, and never suspect that death had arrived with the autumn trade winds. By evening, the ships were empty, and the goods were scattered across London like seeds planted in fertile soil. The dock workers went home to their families, their clothes smelling of the sea and that strange, sweet rot odor they couldn't quite wash away. They ate their dinners, kissed their children good night, and slept peacefully, unaware that they just participated in the greatest catastrophe their city would ever face. Because that's how it always begins, isn't it? Not with trumpets or warnings or any chance to prepare. Just another day, another job, another ship unloaded. Normal life continuing until the moment it stops being normal and becomes something else entirely, something monstrous and unstoppable, something that will kill half of everyone you know before anyone even understands what's happening. Clear where you live because it matters. London in 1348 is not the grand capital it will become, not the sprawling metropolis of empire and industry. It's a cramped, stinking, glorious nightmare of approximately 50,000 souls packed into a space that should comfortably hold maybe half that. Your house, if you're lucky enough to own one rather than renting a corner of someone else's room, is 3 stories tall, but each story barely 6 feet high, so you're constantly hunching to avoid the ceiling beams. The ground floor is your shop or workshop where you practice whatever trade keeps you fed. Weaving, maybe, or leatherworking, or baking, or any of the hundreds of specialized crafts that medieval London requires. The second floor is where you live, cooking, eating, sleeping, all in the same room because separate bedrooms are a luxury for the rich. The third floor is storage, accessible by a ladder so steep it's practically a vertical climb, where you keep the things you need but don't use daily. The walls of your house are so thin you can hear everything your neighbors do, their arguments, their lovemaking, their children crying in the night, their morning coughing fits. Privacy is not a concept that exists for people of your class. Privacy is for nobles in their manor houses, for merchants wealthy enough to afford rooms they don't actually need. For you, life is communal by necessity and architecture, every breath shared, every sound transmitted through timber and daub that's already starting to rot from the constant London damp. The streets, and we're using that term very generously, are barely 6 feet wide in places, muddy tracks paved with whatever people could scavenge, broken pottery mostly, and river stones, and sometimes just compacted garbage that's been walked on so many times that it's almost become solid. The center of each street is an open sewer, a channel where people dump their chamber pots each morning, where butchers toss the parts of animals no one wants, where everything unwanted flows sluggishly towards the Thames. You've learned to walk carefully, to watch where you step, to accept that your shoes will always be covered in substances you'd rather not think about. The air inside your house is thick with smoke from the central hearth, since proper chimneys are expensive, and most people make do with a hole in the roof that lets out maybe half the smoke, while the rest settles in your lungs and stains the walls black. You've been coughing since childhood. Everyone has. That constant medieval hack that's just part of being alive. The fire burns day and night from October to April because the English cold is brutal and your house has no insulation beyond the bodies of your family huddled together for warmth. In summer you swelter, the timber walls trapping heat and the smell of 50,000 people living on top of each other, their waste and their work and their lives all mixing into an odor that visitors from the countryside say they can smell from miles away. This is your world. Cramped, filthy, loud, communal, uncomfortable, and utterly normal. You've never known anything else, so you don't realize what's about to make it so much worse. You don't realize that this architectural density, this forced proximity, this sharing of air and space and surfaces has created the perfect conditions for something terrible. Your city is a trap, and you're all caught in it, and the trap is about to spring shut.
It starts small, the way apocalypses always do. It starts with old Thomas, the baker, 3 doors down, who doesn't open his shop one Thursday morning in late October. This isn't entirely unusual. Thomas has been looking poorly for weeks, complaining of exhaustion, of aches in his joints that he blamed on the approaching winter and the old injury from when a sack of flour fell on him years ago. His wife, Martha, tells anyone who asks that he's resting, that he'll be fine, that it's just a fever, and everyone knows fevers come and go like the tide. You believe her because what else are you going to do? Fevers happen. People get sick. Most recover, especially if they're otherwise healthy, which Thomas mostly is, despite his limp and his complaints. You go about your business. You work in your shop, greeting customers, arguing over prices, doing the endless calculations that medieval commerce requires when you can't write but have to remember who owes what to whom. You eat your evening meal, pottage again, that thick vegetable stew that's been simmering over your fire for 3 days, each day adding new scraps to replace what you've eaten. You sleep next to your wife and children in the communal bed, your bodies pressed together for warmth, breathing each other's air, sharing whatever illness any of you might be carrying. This is normal. This is life. This is how it's always been. Friday comes, and Thomas still hasn't emerged. Martha stops answering when people knock on her door, though you can hear movement inside, hear low voices and what might be crying. The baker's daughter, who lives 2 streets over with her husband and their 3 young children, doesn't show up to the well where the women gather each morning to draw water and exchange gossip. Someone mentions they saw the physician, the one who charges too much but knows things the local healers don't, entering the baker's house at dawn, his bag heavy with whatever mysterious implements doctors carry. And then Saturday morning, you smell it. That smell. Sweet and rotten and wrong, seeping through the shared walls between your house and Thomas's, impossible to ignore or explain away. You've smelled death before. Everyone has. But this is different. Stronger, more insistent, more recent. Something bad is happening in the baker's house. Something worse than a simple fever. And the worst part is, you're not entirely surprised. The worst part is that somewhere deep in your mind, beneath all the daily concerns and petty worries, you've been expecting something like this. Ever since those ships arrived, ever since people started whispering about sailors found dead in the holds, ever since the merchants from Dover brought stories of entire French villages going silent, everyone dead within a week, bodies left unburied because there was no one left to bury them. Sunday morning, the baker's door is marked with a red cross, painted hastily in what looks like pig's blood, still dripping in the weak autumn sunlight. Everyone on your street knows what this means, though no official proclamation has been made yet. It means, stay away. It means, death lives here. It means, pray to whatever saints you trust and hope that this house is the only one marked, that whatever killed the baker and his wife stays contained within those timber walls. But you know better. You've heard the stories from the continent, and you know that when death comes like this, it doesn't stop at one house, doesn't respect boundaries or prayers or the desperate hope that maybe this time it will be different. It never is. You wake up one morning in early November feeling tired, more than tired, exhausted, as if you've been working in the fields all day, even though you've just opened your eyes and the sun hasn't even risen yet. Your head aches with that deep skull-level pain that makes even your teeth hurt. Your joints ache. Every part of you aches with a deep bone-level pain that makes even lying still uncomfortable, makes even breathing feel like effort. You tell yourself it's nothing, just the cold weather, just sleeping wrong on the thin straw mattress, just the usual miseries of being alive in 1348 London. You felt worse. You'll feel better. You just need to get up and move around and let the blood flow properly. But when you try to stand, your legs won't quite hold you. Your wife looks at you with concern that's trying very hard to not become fear. She helps you back down, tells you to rest, that she'll handle the shop today, that you're probably just overtired from working too hard. You let her believe this. You want to believe it yourself, but then the fever hits, sudden and vicious, turning your skin hot and clammy at the same time. You're burning up but shivering, sweating through your linen shirt but freezing. Your teeth chattering so hard you're afraid you'll crack them. Your wife piles blankets on you, but they don't help. Nothing helps. The room spins when you close your eyes and lurches sickeningly when you open them. Your children are hovering nearby, their faces pale and worried, and you want to tell them you'll be fine, but you can't make the words come out right. Your wife sends them away, tells them to stay with the neighbors, though you wonder what neighbors will take them when half the street is already sick. She sits beside you with damp cloths, pressing them to your forehead, your neck, your wrists, murmuring prayers under her breath, the prayers of someone who's trying very hard to believe they'll work. And then you notice the swelling. It starts in your groin, a vague discomfort at first, easy to ignore among all the other pains racking your body. But within hours it's impossible to ignore, a lump growing beneath your skin with horrifying speed. You touch it and the pain is so intense you cry out, a sound you didn't know you could make, animal and desperate. Your wife peels back your clothes to look, and you see her face go white. The lump is the size of an apple now, maybe larger, a grotesque bulge in your groin that's hot to the touch. The skin around it stretched tight and discolored, purpling like a bruise but worse, darker, angrier. This is the bubo, though you don't know that word yet. This is the defining symptom that will give the plague its name centuries from now. Bubonic, from the Greek for groin, for the swellings that appear in the lymph nodes where the body tries and fails to fight off an infection it has no defense against. Within another day, the bubo is the size of an apple, hard and hot, and so painful that even the lightest brush of fabric against it makes you scream. Your wife tries lancing it with a heated knife, the way the old women say to treat abscesses, and what comes out is worse than blood, thick and dark and foul-smelling, more pus than liquid, and it doesn't help. Nothing helps. The swelling doesn't go down. If anything, it gets worse, and new lumps are forming now, in your armpits, on your neck, your body's lymph system desperately trying to contain an infection that can't be contained. This is the bubo announcing loudly and clearly what you already knew. You're dying. No ambiguity, no false hope, no possibility that this is just a bad fever that will break in a few days. Just truth, swollen and agonizing and absolutely certain. The plague doctor arrives on your third day of fever, summoned by your wife, who spent the last coins you had saved to pay for his visit.
He arrives wearing what will become the most iconic and terrifying costume in medical history, though you don't know that yet. Don't know that this image will haunt humanity for centuries, appearing in art and literature and nightmares long after the plague itself has been conquered. You just know he looks like something from a fever dream, a tall figure in a long black robe that brushes the filthy floor of your house, leather gloves reaching past his elbows, and that mask, that horrible bird-beaked mask that makes him look like some kind of demon or death angel come to collect your soul. The beak is stuffed with herbs and spices, camphor, rose petals, myrrh, cloves, an aromatic mixture that's supposed to filter the poisoned air everyone believes is causing this plague. The miasma theory, they call it, the idea that disease spreads through bad smells, through corrupt vapors rising from swamps and cesspits and rotting matter. So the doctor fills his mask with good smells, thinking that will protect him, and it does absolutely nothing, because the plague isn't spread by bad air, it's spread by fleas, by the tiny insects that live on rats, by a chain of transmission that won't be understood for another 500 years. But the doctor doesn't know this, so he wears his mask and his gloves and his long robe treated with wax to make it impermeable, and he believes, he has to believe, that these measures will keep him safe enough to do his work. He doesn't touch you directly, of course. He pokes at your buboes with a long wooden stick, prodding the swollen lumps while you bite down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. He asks questions in a voice muffled by the mask, made strange and distant and inhuman by the beak that juts out from his face. How long have you been sick? When did the swellings appear? Have you had contact with anyone else who's ill? Stupid questions, useless questions, because by now half your street is sick and contact is unavoidable when you live packed together like salted fish in a barrel. The treatment he offers is medieval medicine at its finest, which is to say it's absolutely useless and possibly makes things worse. He might lance the buboes, using his long stick to hold your flesh steady while he cuts into the swelling with a blade he hasn't cleaned since the last patient. The release of pressure feels like relief for about 5 seconds, until the real pain hits, the raw, exposed tissue, the infection given a new route into your bloodstream, the blood and pus that flow out taking nothing evil with them, just making room for more swelling to fill the space. He might recommend bloodletting, because of course he does, medieval medicine's answer to everything from headaches to broken legs to plague symptoms. The theory is that your body's humors are out of balance, that you have too much blood or the wrong kind of blood, and removing some will restore equilibrium. So he makes cuts in your arms or applies leeches to your skin, drawing out blood you can't afford to lose when you're already dying, weakening you further in the name of healing. You submit to this, because what choice do you have?
He's the expert, the learned man who studied at universities you've never seen, who read books you can't read, who knows secrets about the body that common people don't. Surely he knows what he's doing. Surely there's a reason for this torture. He might prescribe a poultice of ground emeralds if you're rich, which you're not, or crushed herbs if you're poor, which you are. Sage and rue and juniper mixed with honey or vinegar, packed onto the buboes, where they do exactly nothing except smell vaguely pleasant and give your wife something to do, some action to take that feels like helping, even though it isn't. He might recommend prayer, which at least is free and can't make things worse. He might suggest you prepare your soul for death, make your confession while you still can, get your affairs in order before the fever takes your mind completely. None of it matters. He knows it doesn't matter. You know it doesn't matter. Your wife knows it doesn't matter. But everyone goes through the motions anyway, because what else is there? He's a professional, acknowledging your suffering with the only tools he has, even if those tools are utterly inadequate to the task. He leaves after 20 minutes, his beak bobbing as he moves, his payment already collected at the door. You hear him walking to the next house, where someone else is dying, where he'll perform the same useless rituals and collect another fee and move on to the next and the next, working his way through the city like death's accountant, recording suffering he can't prevent or ease. Here's the thing about the Black Death that the history books don't quite capture, that the statistics and mortality rates and historical analysis somehow miss: the speed. Not just how fast the disease kills, though 3 to 5 days from first symptoms to death is horrifyingly quick, but how fast the entire social structure collapses around it, how fast normal life becomes impossible, how fast a functioning city turns into something that resembles hell. Monday, London is operating more or less normally. Yes, there are sick people. There are always sick people, but the city continues. The markets are open, the shops are trading, the Thames docks are busy with ships and cargo and the endless flow of commerce. People are going about their business, buying bread, selling wool, arguing about debts and marriages and which tavern has the best ale. The usual concerns of usual lives, the background hum of urban existence that's been constant for so long no one remembers what silence sounds like. By Friday, a quarter of your street is dead or dying. The baker's entire family is gone. The weaver 2 houses down is gone. The family across the alley, parents, 4 children, grandmother, all gone or in their final throes, their groans audible through the thin walls even at midday. The smith who lives at the end of the street is dead in his shop, collapsed over his anvil, his apprentice fled no one knows where. Every house bears a red cross now, or will soon, the marks spreading like the plague itself, no longer a warning to avoid specific houses, but just a catalogue of universal suffering. By the following Monday, the bodies are piling up faster than they can be buried. The church bells that used to ring for each funeral have stopped, because if they kept ringing, they'd never stop ringing, just one continuous death knell echoing across the city day and night until the sound drove everyone mad. The priests tried at first, they really did, but there aren't enough priests left, and there isn't enough time, and there are too many bodies. So the bells stopped. And now death happens in silence, except for the groans of the dying and the weeping of those who still have tears left to shed. The markets are half empty because the vendors are dead or hiding or too sick to work. The stalls that are open charge outrageous prices because supply and demand don't stop for apocalypse. And if you have food to sell and people desperate to buy, why not make a profit? Some call it evil, others call it practical. Mostly, it just is. Another feature of the nightmare your city has become. Your neighborhood, which 2 weeks ago was vibrant and alive despite all its squalor and poverty and medieval discomfort, now feels like a ghost town where the ghosts haven't had the decency to actually leave yet. They're still here, dying in their houses, crying out for help that isn't coming, slowly rotting in beds no one dares approach because everyone knows that going near the sick means becoming sick yourself. The streets are empty, except for the death carts that make their rounds each dawn, and the few desperate souls still trying to function, still going through the motions of normal life, because the alternative is to acknowledge that normal life has ended and might never return. This is what speed means in the context of plague. Not just individual deaths happening quickly, but society itself dying. All the complex interconnected systems that keep a city functioning simply breaking down in a matter of days. Food distribution fails, sanitation fails, law enforcement fails, social bonds fail. The thin veneer of civilization that everyone took for granted turns out to be thinner than anyone suspected, and beneath it, there's just chaos and suffering and the desperate scramble to survive one more day. When medicine fails and death surrounds you and every rational solution proves useless, people get creative with their desperation. Some turn to religion with an intensity that borders on or crosses into outright madness.
The Flagellants arrive in London from the continent in late November, processions of men stripped to the waist despite the bitter cold, whipping themselves bloody as they march through the nearly empty streets. Their backs are raw meat, layers of skin flayed away by leather whips studded with small pieces of iron, the blood running down their spines and soaking into their breeches, freezing in the November air. They march in formation, chanting hymns that sound more like screams, their voices raw from days of continuous prayer and self-mortification. They believe, genuinely, completely, with the fervor of the truly desperate, that God is punishing humanity for its sins, that only sufficient suffering will appease his wrath and stop the plague. So they suffer voluntarily, publicly, performing penance for sins both real and imagined, hoping that their pain will somehow balance the cosmic ledger and make God merciful again. You watch them from your window, assuming you're still healthy enough to stand and look out the window, and you think maybe they're onto something. Maybe this is punishment. Maybe you do deserve this. Maybe you've lived your life wrong, been too greedy or too lustful or too proud, and now God is collecting his due. The Flagellants' message is simple and terrible, and somehow comforting in its clarity. This is your fault, but it can be fixed. Redemption is possible if only you suffer enough. It's easier to believe that than to believe the alternative, that the plague is random, meaningless, striking good and evil alike with complete indifference, that there's no cosmic justice at work, just bacteria and fleas and the bad luck of living in 1348. Others blame the Jews, because of course they do, medieval Europe's favorite scapegoat for anything from bad harvests to bad weather to bad luck. The logic, if you can call it that, goes something like this. The plague must have been caused by someone, some malevolent force deliberately poisoning wells and spreading disease. And who else could it be but the Jews, those convenient outsiders who've never quite fit into Christian society? Pogroms break out across the continent, entire Jewish communities murdered by their neighbors in fits of plague-induced paranoia, their homes burned, their possessions looted, their deaths achieving nothing except satisfying the desperate human need to blame someone, anyone, for incomprehensible suffering. London is relatively restrained in this regard, mostly because the Jews were expelled from England decades ago by Edward I, but the impulse is there, the desperate need for a human villain to explain an inhuman catastrophe. If not Jews, then foreigners. If not foreigners, then the poor. If not the poor, then someone, anyone, because accepting that the plague just is, that it's no one's fault, that it's simply a natural disaster like a flood or earthquake, is somehow more terrifying than any conspiracy theory. Some people try to flee, packing what they can carry and heading for the countryside, convinced that the plague is a city problem, that fresh country air will save them. They're wrong, of course. Most of them are probably already infected, the bacteria multiplying in their blood even as they walk, spreading the disease to villages that might otherwise have been spared. But you can't blame them for trying. When your city is dying around you, when your neighbors are piling up like cordwood, when the very air seems poisonous with death, the urge to run is overwhelming. So they run, and the plague runs with them. And soon enough, there's nowhere left to run to because everywhere is infected. The whole country, the whole continent, the whole known world drowning in death.
and some people simply go mad. The mind can only take so much horror before something breaks. You see them sometimes, wandering the empty streets, talking to people who aren't there, laughing at nothing, eyes vacant and staring. Some of them are simply plague victims in the late stages, the fever having taken their minds before it takes their bodies. But others are survivors who've lost everyone they loved, who've watched their families die one by one, who've buried their children with their own hands, and something inside them just snapped. They're alive but not living, present but not present, shells that keep walking and breathing out of habit, while everything that made them human has fled. This is what desperation looks like. This is what happens when every rational solution fails, and all that's left is the irrational, the desperate prayers and self-harm and scapegoating and madness. It doesn't help. None of it helps. The plague continues regardless of how much you whip yourself, or pray, or blame, or flee. But at least it's something to do, some action to take, some illusion of control in a situation where control is impossible. And sometimes, when everything else has been taken from you, illusion is all you have left. The graveyards fill up first, and they fill up fast. The parish churchyards that were supposed to serve their communities for centuries, that had been accumulating bodies at a slow, manageable rate for generations, are suddenly overwhelmed, packed full, overflowing. There's simply no more room, no way to dig graves fast enough to keep up with the death rate, no way to maintain the decent burial practices that everyone took for granted back when death was a normal occurrence rather than a constant avalanche. Bodies are stacked in mass graves, barely covered with dirt because there's not enough time or manpower for proper burial rites. The grave diggers, the few who haven't fled or died themselves, work around the clock, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar, trying desperately not to breathe the air that everyone still believes carries the plague. They dig pits as fast as they can, throw bodies in as fast as they arrive, cover them with whatever dirt they can scrape together, and start the next pit. There's no dignity in it, no respect for the dead, no careful arrangement or marking of graves, just disposal, industrial-scale disposal of human remains that have become a public health problem rather than beloved family members. The priests who would normally conduct funerals are dead themselves, or overwhelmed, or have fled to country estates where they pray the plague won't follow them. Those who remain do what they can, but how do you conduct a funeral for 50 people at once? How do you memorialize individual lives when there are too many deaths to count and not enough hours in the day to properly mourn even one? So the rituals simplify, reduce, become perfunctory. A quick prayer, a perfunctory blessing, next batch please, the spiritual assembly line of apocalypse. Someone, some civic official whose name history won't remember, has the bright idea to consecrate new burial grounds outside the city walls, emergency cemeteries for emergency times. The most famous will be at Smithfield, north of the city, where they dig enormous pits, trenches really, 50 feet long and 20 feet deep. The bodies are brought by cart, loaded on wagons like cargo, driven through streets where the living huddle indoors and pray the death carts pass them by. At Smithfield, they're unloaded, dumped into the pits in layers, each layer coated with a thin coating of lime that's supposed to speed decomposition and reduce the smell but doesn't really do either. Thousands upon thousands of Londoners end up in these pits, their names unrecorded, their lives reduced to anonymous bones in the earth, their individual stories lost in the collective tragedy. You know people in those pits, probably. It's hard to keep track anymore. The baker and his family are there somewhere, their specific location unknowable in the chaos. The woman who sold vegetables at the market, the children who used to play in the street, the weaver's apprentice, the smith, the priest from your parish church, all of them gone, buried in mass graves that will be forgotten within a generation, built over, eventually, turned into marketplaces and fields, and eventually construction sites where future Londoners will be shocked to discover how many bones they're building on. And still, the bodies keep coming. The death carts make their rounds each morning, though morning is optimistic. They run continuously now, day and night, an endless circuit through the dying city. The drivers call out, "Bring out your dead," in voices gone hoarse from repetition, from breathing air thick with death, from the psychological weight of being the person who collects corpses for a living during the worst pandemic in human history. You hear the wheels creaking on the cobblestones, hear the soft thud of bodies being tossed into the cart like sacks of grain, hear the occasional groan from someone who's not quite dead yet, but will be soon enough. You pray, actually pray, genuinely pray, despite whatever doubts you might harbor about God's existence or mercy, that you won't be on tomorrow's cart, that whatever happens, you'll die in your bed with your family around you, rather than groaning in some cart on the way to a mass grave, mixed with strangers, your body just another item in a load of human refuse. This is what dignity has been reduced to, the hope for a marginally less horrible death than the worst-case scenario. This is what prayer has become. Please let it be quick. Please let me die at home. Please don't let me end up in the pit with no name and no marker and no one to remember I existed. If you survive, and that's a big if, maybe a 40–60% chance, depending on which strain of plague you contracted and how strong your immune system is in sheer dumb luck, you wake up one day in late December or early January to realize that London is a different city now, fundamentally, irrevocably changed, half empty, eerily quiet. Entire neighborhoods abandoned, their residents either dead or fled, their houses standing empty with doors hanging open and contents looted by survivors desperate for anything of value. You can walk through streets that used to be impassable due to crowds and see no one, not a soul, just empty buildings and the occasional rat, and the wind blowing scraps of cloth and paper through scenes that look like they've been abandoned for years rather than weeks. The silence is overwhelming, oppressive, wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. Cities aren't supposed to be silent. They're supposed to hum with human activity, with voices and footsteps and cartwheels and animals and the constant background noise of thousands of people living in close proximity. This silence feels like the absence of something essential, like the city itself is dead, even though you're still alive within it. You're one of those survivors, and you're not sure if you should feel lucky or cursed. Lucky to be alive, certainly, so many aren't, but alive in a world that's been fundamentally broken, where everyone you see is haunted by the same trauma, the same losses, the same incomprehensible horror of watching half the city die in a matter of months. You all wear the same expression now, the survivors, a kind of hollow-eyed exhaustion, a 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much death, from burying too many loved ones, from spending too many nights wondering if you'll wake up with fever and buboes. The economy is in shambles. The shops that are still open have almost nothing to sell because the supply chains have broken down completely. No one is farming because half the farmers are dead. No one is importing goods because the ships stopped coming. No one is manufacturing because the workshops are empty. There's wealth, technically, coins and goods and property, but what good is wealth when there's nothing to buy? You could be the richest person in London and still starve because there's no food available at any price. Paradoxically, if you're a laborer, you can suddenly demand wages that would have been unthinkable a year ago. There aren't enough workers left to do all the jobs that needing doing, so the few who survived can name their price. The lords and merchants and guildmasters complain bitterly about this, cry about the breakdown of traditional wage structures, bemoan the uppity peasants who don't know their place. But they pay anyway because they need workers, and workers are suddenly scarce. This will have consequences, social and political consequences that will ripple out for decades, eventually contributing to the peasants' revolt and the slow erosion of feudalism. But right now, in January 1449, you're just grateful to be able to feed your surviving family. The social order is fracturing. The rich are still rich, technically, but their authority feels more tenuous now. They couldn't save themselves any better than you could. Their money, their fine houses, their political connections, their supposed divine favor, none of it mattered when the plague came knocking. Death was remarkably egalitarian, taking nobles and peasants alike, and that's shaken everyone's faith in the natural social hierarchy. If God doesn't protect the righteous and wealthy, if virtue and status provide no defense against disease, then what's the justification for their power? This is a dangerous question, and no one is quite asking it out loud yet, but it's there, hanging in the air like the smell of mass graves, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to give it voice. You're alive in a ghost city, surrounded by the physical and psychological wreckage of catastrophe. Every street holds memories of people who used to live there and don't anymore. Every empty house is a reminder of families lost. Every survivor you meet carries their own unbearable burden of grief and trauma. This is what survival looks like. This is the prize for living through the worst pandemic in human history. Not triumph or relief, just exhaustion and loss, and the grim knowledge that you have to keep going somehow, have to rebuild somehow, have to find a way to live in a world that will never be the same. Slowly, painfully, London tries to rebuild. The plague doesn't disappear entirely. It will flare up repeatedly over the next few centuries, smaller outbreaks that everyone fears will become another Black Death, but mostly don't. But the worst of it passes. By spring, the death rate is slowing. By summer, people are cautiously emerging from their houses, blinking in the sunlight like miners emerging from a collapsed shaft, hardly daring to believe that maybe, possibly, they might actually survive this. There's work to be done. Mountains of work. Bodies to bury properly, or at least more properly than they were buried during the height of the crisis. Houses to reclaim or tear down. Many are structurally unsound now, weakened by months of neglect and the kind of damage that happens when everyone inside dies and no one maintains anything. Markets to reopen, though this is complicated by the fact that so many merchants and vendors are dead and their surviving families are fighting over who owns what. The legal system is overwhelmed with inheritance disputes, with property claims, with all the bureaucratic aftermath of mass death. Life tries to resume, but it's not the same life. It can't be. Too much has changed, too much has been lost, too many assumptions about how the world works have been shattered. A labor shortage fundamentally alters the economy in ways that the ruling class absolutely hates but can't prevent. Workers have leverage now. The kind of leverage that comes from scarcity, and they use it. They demand higher wages, better conditions, the right to move between employers rather than being bound to one lord for life. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, will try to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it won't work. You can't legislate away supply and demand, can't force the economy back to how it was through parliamentary fiat. The old order is dying, slowly, and something new is being born in its place. The church, which should have been a source of comfort during the crisis, is fundamentally weakened. So many priests died. They were on the front lines, after all, administering last rites to the dying, spending hours in close contact with plague victims. The survivors are often poorly educated replacements, rushed through training to fill empty positions, not quite up to the spiritual and intellectual standards of their predecessors. And beyond that, there's the uncomfortable fact that prayer didn't stop the dying. The righteous died alongside the wicked. The churches offered no sanctuary. God, if he was paying attention at all, seemed remarkably indifferent to human suffering. This doesn't destroy faith, that's too strong, but it shakes it, introduces doubts that wouldn't have been thinkable before, opens space for questioning and skepticism that will eventually flower into the Reformation. Social bonds are strange now. Everyone has lost someone. Parents, children, spouses, siblings. Grief is universal, which should be unifying, but somehow isn't. It's too big, too overwhelming, too individual even in its universality. You can't really share it because everyone's carrying their own unbearable load. You pass people on the street and you both know, you both understand, but there's nothing to say. What words could possibly capture what you've all been through? So you nod, or you don't, and you keep walking, and you carry your grief in silence, because what else can you do? Some people try to pretend it didn't happen, or at least try to minimize it, move on quickly, rebuild their lives as if the plague was just a bad storm that passed through. Others can't move on, remain trapped in the trauma, haunted by memories of things they saw and did and failed to do. There's no right way to survive apocalypse, no instruction manual for rebuilding your life after half your city dies. Everyone just does their best, fumbles through, makes it up as they go. And everywhere, always is the fear that it will happen again, that the plague isn't gone, just dormant, that next year or next decade the ships will arrive from the continent carrying more than just cargo and the whole nightmare will repeat. This fear isn't justified. The plague will return again and again, though never quite as bad as 1448. But even knowing it could be worse doesn't make the fear easier to live with. It just means you're constantly alert, constantly watching for symptoms, constantly aware that the thin security of normal life could collapse again at any moment. This is the aftermath. This is what survival means. Not celebration or relief or any kind of triumph, just the grim determination to keep going, to rebuild, to somehow construct a future on the foundation of incomprehensible loss. London will recover, eventually. It will grow larger than it ever was, become a true capital, an empire's heart. But it will never forget 1348, never fully heal from the wound the Black Death carved into its soul.
The medieval mind struggled to make sense of the Black Death, because how could you possibly make sense of something like that? How could you construct a coherent explanation for an event that killed between a third and half of everyone in Europe within 5 years, an event that struck seemingly at random, taking the healthy along with the sick, the young along with the old, the righteous along with the sinful? An event that ignored prayers and treatments and every attempt to understand or control it. The explanations they came up with ranged from the almost correct to the completely insane, though, to be fair, they were working without germ theory, without microscopes, without any way to see the actual mechanism of disease transmission. Miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread by bad air, by poisonous vapors rising from swamps and rotting matter and corrupted elements, was the closest they got to understanding transmission, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Bad air does correlate with disease, though for different reasons than they thought. The plague did spread in dense urban areas with poor sanitation, though not because of vapors, but because of rats and fleas thriving in those conditions. Some blamed an unfavorable alignment of planets, which sounds ridiculous now, but was serious astronomy in the 14th century. Educated people genuinely believed that the movements of celestial bodies influenced earthly events, that certain planetary conjunctions could corrupt the air, or disturb the humors, or otherwise create conditions conducive to disease. There was even a specific culprit identified, the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius on March 20, 1345, which astrologers calculated would produce pestilential vapors. The timing was wrong. The plague didn't hit Europe until 1347, but that didn't stop people from believing the correlation was real. Some blamed God's wrath, which at least had the virtue of being emotionally satisfying, even if it was medically useless. The plague as divine punishment for human sin made sense in a medieval worldview, where everything that happened was part of God's plan. If you believed that God controlled all events, then the plague couldn't be random. It had to mean something, had to be a message or a warning or a punishment. This led to the Flagellants and their self-mortification, to calls for moral reform and stricter observance of religious law, to endless sermons about repentance and the coming end times. Others blamed everything from witchcraft to vengeful spirits to demonic possession to the simple fact that 1348 was just a cursed year and there was nothing anyone could have done. Some physicians published treatises suggesting the plague was caused by corrupted wells, by poisoned food, by looking at the sick, by thinking too much about death. Every explanation was simultaneously taken seriously and recognized as inadequate, because none of them led to effective treatments or prevention. No one, of course, blamed the rats, or more specifically, the fleas on the rats. The actual vector of transmission, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas, primarily the oriental rat flea, transmitted to humans when the flea's preferred hosts, rats, died off and they had to find new sources of blood, wouldn't be understood until 1894, when Alexander Yersin identified the bacterium during an outbreak in Hong Kong. Even then, it took years to fully understand the transmission chain, to connect the dots between rats and fleas and humans and death.
So people died by the millions without ever knowing why, without ever understanding what was killing them, making up elaborate theories about cosmic punishment and poisoned air and planetary influences, while the real culprits, tiny insects carrying even tinier bacteria, went completely unnoticed, continuing their deadly work unimpeded by human understanding or intervention. The irony is almost unbearable. The thing that killed half of Europe was invisible to medieval eyes, too small to see, too simple to imagine, while scholars wasted time debating whether Saturn or God or poisoned wells was responsible. In the end, all those interpretations, wrong as they were, served a psychological purpose. They gave people something to blame, some framework for understanding, some illusion of control, or at least comprehension. Better to believe the plague was punishment you could atone for, or cosmic bad luck you could predict, than to believe it was random, meaningless, completely beyond human understanding or influence. Better to die believing your suffering meant something than to die knowing it was just bad luck and bad timing and bacteria you couldn't see or fight or escape. The Black Death killed somewhere between 40 to 60% of London's population. The exact number is unknowable, record-keeping being what it was, but the scale is undeniable. Somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people died in a city of 50,000, died within the span of 18 months, died in conditions of terror and suffering that defy adequate description. It was the single worst disaster in London's history up to that point, and it would remain the worst until the Great Fire of 1666, which at least had the decency to kill far fewer people, even if it destroyed more property. And yet London survived. It always survives. Cities are surprisingly resilient things, more resilient than the people who build them. Within a generation, the population had started to recover. Within a century, London was approaching its pre-plague size. Within 2 centuries, it was larger than it had ever been, sprawling beyond the old Roman walls, growing into a true metropolis, the heart of an empire that would eventually span the globe. The mass graves at Smithfield were built over, forgotten, rediscovered centuries later by startled construction workers who couldn't quite believe how many bones they were finding, how many layers of dead Londoners they were building on. The trauma faded from living memory, as trauma does. The survivors aged and died, taking their first-hand experiences with them. Their children knew the plague only as stories, second-hand accounts that lacked the visceral horror of lived experience. Their grandchildren knew it only as history, something that happened long ago to people they never met. The Black Death became a date to memorize, a statistic to cite, a historical fact rather than a living wound. This is how time works, how society heals, or at least scabs over its injuries. The present becomes the past, becomes ancient history, and the unendurable becomes merely interesting. But something changed, something fundamental. The world after the Black Death was different from the world before it, changed in ways both obvious and subtle, immediate and delayed. The economy shifted, labor became valuable in ways it hadn't been before. Workers gained leverage they never had, and the strict feudal hierarchy began its long, slow collapse. Social structures loosened, old certainties were questioned, the unquestioned authority of church and nobility was questioned. Not immediately, not universally, but the seeds were planted, watered by the blood of plague victims, growing slowly into the social transformations that would define the later medieval period. The seeds of the Renaissance can be traced back to the upheaval caused by the Black Death. The labor shortage made education and skills more valuable, created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. The questioning of religious authority opened space for humanist thought, for renewed interest in classical learning, for art and literature that celebrated human potential rather than dwelling on human sinfulness. The Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, all of these later movements have roots in the social and intellectual ferment caused by the plague's devastation. And London learned something, though it took centuries to fully absorb the lesson, centuries more to act on it, that disease doesn't care about social class or divine favor or national boundaries. that a ship arriving at the docks can carry more than just cargo, can carry invisible death that spreads through a city faster than any army, that the line between civilization and collapse is thinner than anyone wants to admit, that all the elaborate structures of society, law and trade and social hierarchy and religious authority can break down within weeks when sufficient pressure is applied, that we're all, always, just one whispered rumor away from the night the Black Death comes again. They learned these lessons, though they forgot them often enough. Plague returned to London repeatedly, 1361, 1369, 1374-75, smaller outbreaks every few years, culminating in the Great Plague of 1665 that killed another 100,000 people before mysteriously burning itself out. Each time people remembered the lessons of 1348. Each time they forgot them again as soon as the immediate danger passed. This is human nature, the tendency to assume that disasters are anomalies rather than patterns, that the current peace will last forever, despite all historical evidence to the contrary.
The Black Death never fully left human consciousness. It became a cultural touchstone, a reference point for ultimate catastrophe, a specter that haunted European imagination for centuries. The plague doctor's mask became an icon, reproduced in art and carnival costumes and eventually horror movies. The concept of quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, was invented in response to plague and remains standard public health practice. The phrase, "bring out your dead," entered the language as a dark joke about mortality. The whole medieval period got unfairly tarred as the Dark Ages, a time of ignorance and suffering, largely because the Black Death loomed so large in historical memory. And now, from the vantage point of the 21st century, we look back at 1348 with a mixture of horror and scientific understanding. We know exactly what killed all those people. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium, easily treatable with modern antibiotics. We know how it spread. Rats and fleas, poor sanitation, dense urban populations with no concept of infectious disease. We know it wasn't divine punishment or corrupted air or planetary influences, just bad luck and bad biology and the inevitable result of humans living in close proximity with rodent vectors. We know all this, understand it completely, have the tools to prevent and treat plague if it ever returns, and yet here we are, having learned nothing. Still packing ourselves into dense cities, still creating conditions where infectious disease can spread rapidly through vulnerable populations, still responding to pandemics with the same mixture of denial, panic, and desperate scrambling that characterized 1348. We have science now, antibiotics, modern medicine, all the tools medieval Londoners would have killed for, and yet when disease comes, and it always comes eventually, we're still caught flat-footed, still make the same mistakes, still fail to prepare adequately, because who wants to spend resources on disasters that might never happen? The Black Death ended. The people who lived through it are gone. Dust in mass graves or scattered ashes or bones dug up by archaeologists and catalogued in museum collections. Their suffering is over, has been over for 7 centuries, but the city they lived in is still here, built on their graves, inhabited by their distant descendants, still learning and forgetting the same lessons about mortality and disease and the fragility of civilization. Still vulnerable to the next plague, whatever form it takes, whenever it arrives. Still just one ship, one whispered rumor, one moment away from the night the Black Death comes again. And so the bells fell silent. Death carts stopped their rounds. The mass graves were covered over. And slowly, so slowly, London remembered how to live again. But the city was changed. Everyone was changed. You can't watch half your world die and remain the same person. You can't bury your children, your neighbors, your entire street, and simply move on as if nothing happened. The Black Death ended, but its shadow remained. Still remains, even now, 7 centuries later. In the bones beneath the streets, in the empty spaces where whole families once lived, in the questions we still ask about suffering, about randomness, about why some survive and others don't. Medieval Londoners didn't have antibiotics or epidemiology or any understanding of bacteria. They had prayers that didn't work, treatments that made things worse, and the grim determination to keep living even when death surrounded them. Maybe that's all any of us ever have. If this journey through plague-ravaged London helped you drift off tonight, consider leaving a like before sleep takes you, and subscribe for more forgotten stories from history's darkest hours. There are so many more tales waiting to be told. Sweet dreams, survivor. May you wake in a world kinder than the one you've just visited. Until next time, rest well.